Let's talk about the difference in camera settings I would use when doing portrait photography versus landscape photography. Both portrait and landscape photography were topics suggested by you on my Facebook page this week. Why not combine the two into a single video and compare and contrast how I shoot differently for portraits than I shoot for landscape images? First, let's talk about color. When doing a portrait, I typically want a more neutral color palette to obtain the most natural looking skin tones. To get that, I adjust a couple of things on my camera. First, I can change the picture controls. In my Nikon DSLRs, I get a few options right out of the box. One of them is neutral. Frankly, I don't always make this change. However, it's a good option to use. Second, I always make sure to adjust my white balance. Color temperature can wreak havoc on skin tones, so changing the white balance to match your lighting conditions will help obtain a natural look. One of my recent videos is about performing a white balance preset, which will get you extremely accurate color. And here's a link to that video. When photographing a landscape, I go to the other end of the spectrum. I will almost always amp up the reds and greens using the vivid option in picture controls. White balance may also be a factor when shooting landscape, but most often I use auto. If I don't take the time to get the white balance right on, I will err on the side of a warmer image, which most people find pleasing for landscape photos. Next, let's talk about ISO. I almost always want the lowest ISO available for both portraits and landscapes. That way, I will get a crisp image with as little noise as possible. Now for aperture. When I am taking a portrait shot, I usually have a wider aperture, so the depth of field only covers my subject. That way, the foreground and background are blurred, leaving the viewer to focus on the crisp subject. For an environmental portrait, you probably do not want a sharp background to, quite literally, take the focus away from the main subject. However, when I'm shooting a landscape, I want the opposite, a narrow aperture, so I can get as much as possible in focus. Along with aperture is shutter speed. For portraits, I am usually using some sort of flash or strobe, so I simply want a shutter speed that is under the flash sync speed. The flash burst itself freezes motion, especially in a dark studio. For landscapes, I'm usually shooting wide angle, so I can get away with a slower shutter speed. Additionally, I might be using a tripod, which also allows me to use a slower shutter speed, because the camera will be so stable. If I'm not using a tripod though, I might be able to maintain a slower shutter speed if I have a VR lens. Even the common 18-55 kit lens has VR now. Which leads me to my next topic, lenses. When I'm shooting a portrait, I like to use a moderate telephoto lens. It allows me to get further back from the subject, so their features will appear to be in better proportion. When I'm shooting a landscape, I use a wide-angle lens, obviously to get as much into the image as I can. Additionally, I prefer to use a VR lens. VR stands for vibration reduction, by the way, because I usually like to shoot handheld. A VR lens will allow me to use a slower shutter speed. Lastly, let's talk lighting. When I am shooting a portrait in the studio, and even sometimes outside, I would use artificial light. However, when I'm shooting a landscape, I usually rely on natural light. You may notice that I almost never say always or never. I usually say almost always, or almost never, or usually. That's because every situation is different. Also, I like to experiment. In my experimentation, I often break the rules. There is an exception to every rule after all. For example, I may use artificial light on a landscape if I want to illuminate the foreground. Or if I'm shooting a portrait in a natural setting, I might want to use a narrower aperture to get more of the environment in focus. Also, for an outdoor portrait, I may choose to rely less on strobes or modifiers to take advantage of the natural conditions. Hopefully, you can use some of what I've said today as a guideline and figure out how you like to do things from there. Like I always say, experiment, experiment, experiment. Let me know if you have any questions.